While little things like plot and characters and filmmaking competence are of course all important, if a slasher movie doesn't have inspired death sequences, then it's not going to make an impact. With so much riding on them then, it should be no surprise to learn that directors often shoot multiple versions of a character's demise. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 alternate horror movie deaths you didn't get to see. But first up, an honourable mention. David eats a man's head like a cake, The Lost Boys. Now, I'm quickly throwing this in because there's tragically no footage of this cut scene, and the death in question isn't a big character, but it is far too good to leave out. In The Lost Boys, Kiefer Sutherland's vampire ringleader David makes no concessions for his violent killing of humans, but one cutscene would have highlighted the glee he takes in drinking blood. At one point in the movie, he bites directly into a man's skull, but the kill was supposed to be even longer, with David taking chunks out of the dude's head like he was eating a birthday cake. According to the actor, this was one of his favourite scenes in the movie, explaining, quote, "The part of the scene that I loved the most was literally, it was like a cake. I ate the whole back of his head off and blood just went everywhere. I had been directed to just smile like a child having cake, and the two images were so frightening and scary," end quote. Number 10. Isaac burns to death, Final Destination 5. The Final Destination series is no stranger to alternate deaths for its characters. Hell, the third movie even had a gimmick on the DVD where viewers could pick which version of a death they wanted to see in real time. Kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure game, but where you decide how viciously you want to burn a couple of women to death. The one we're focusing on today, though, comes in the final and severely underrated installment. The death here is granted to Isaac, who's otherwise enjoying a nice spot of acupuncture. Of course, he doesn't know that he's in a Final Destination movie, but the audience absolutely does, so we know having all of those pins embedded in his body will not end well. However, his death in the theatrical cut is a classic bait and switch. It's not the needles in his skin that kill him, or even the fire accidentally ravaging the room, but a falling bust of Buddha that caves his head in from a nearby shelf. It's mostly played for laughs, but his alternate death was far more savage. It's mostly the same, but it finishes with Isaac becoming engulfed by the flames and burning to death, his screams echoing out across the room. Number 9. Eric Matthews is killed by Amanda, Saw 3. Eric Matthews' continued survival in the Saw franchise almost borders on parody. Donnie Wahlberg's character is revealed to have survived near certain death twice. Once after freeing himself from the original leg trap by breaking his foot and slipping free of the shackles, and the second time after surviving an assault from Amanda. If you got the feeling that the writers were just making it up as they went along with this character, then you'd absolutely be right. While Matthews freeing himself after the end of Saw 2 was always on the cards, the next movie was supposed to feature his definitive end. In this sequel, he tangles with Amanda following his escape, a fight he eventually loses. The final sequence leaves her final actions ambiguous, but in the original cut, she outright just murdered him on screen. This sequence, though, was taken out in the edit, which didn't sit well with the actor, who complained about having his character's death undermined. Annoyed, Wahlberg said at the time, quote, "They kept me alive. I told them I wanted to die in part 3, and they took out my death," end quote. Matthews eventually does meet his final, proper, for real this time death in Saw 4, having his head crushed by 2 ice blocks. Number 8. Michael and Loomis's deaths, Halloween 2. While some of the alternate death scenes on this list would have made movies better, this is absolutely not one of them. Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 isn't exactly a masterpiece already, but the theatrical cut ending is at least ballsy, I guess? Here, series staples Dr. Loomis and Michael Myers both end up dead, the former slashed to death in a frankly gruesome display by The Shape, while the latter is sniped by a nearby police officer. The alternate ending, however, had a far cringier version of this scene. Here, Michael throws Loomis through the building they're in, leaving the pair in a field surrounded by police officers. Next, in a very un-Michael Myers move, he decides to take off his mask, grabs Loomis, and hilariously utters the word "die" before stabbing his foe. If having Michael speak in such a lame manner wasn't over the top enough, he then proceeds to get shot like a million times by the police officers before eventually going down. It is incredibly melodramatic and makes Boromir's final stand look positively subdued by comparison. Number 7. Eric and David burn to death, Evil Dead 2013. Evil Dead's 2013 reboot certainly didn't skimp on the gore, but there were a few alternate death sequences which originally showed a far more explicit end to some characters. Eric and David die in the the theatrical cut off screen as the cabin they're in explodes, but a cut scene lingered on the graphic demise of the duo, cutting back inside the cabin after it goes up in flames. Here, the possessed Eric burns to death while writhing on the floor as a close-up shows the gruesome results of the explosion. David, on the other hand, sits against a wall resigned to his fate while the flames slowly creep up his body. One important difference to note though is that this alternate scene shows David actually getting possessed just before he died. Number 6. Brett's skull is crushed and he has his heart ripped out. Alien. Ridley Scott's Alien established an entire horror universe that's still being explored to this day, but his original vision for the mythology of the franchise did drastically differ from what we have now. For instance, deleted scenes from that original flick show how the facehugger eggs were created, with Dallas and other characters being cocooned and transformed into them. Certain death scenes were also initially different as well. For instance, Brett's death went through a bunch of iterations before finally being cut into a mostly bloodless affair. In the final movie, he's just ambushed by the alien and then swiftly taken away to its lair. The original script, though, actually called for the xenomorph to rip out Brett's heart, which naturally would have been far more disturbing. Scott changed his mind before shooting, but even then filmed a different scene still from what we got. In this unrated sequence, the xenomorph would have graphically crushed Brett's skull before violently throwing the character around as he writhed in pain, only then picking him up and taking him away. Number 5. Alex gets devoured. Jaws. While Jaws has gone down in history as an influential blockbuster, it is important to remember that it's still a horror movie first and foremost. Bruce the Shark terrified audiences for years, acting as a mostly unseen threat that sets the tone in the opening scene by violently devouring an unlucky swimmer. However, the death sequences in Jaws were originally much more graphic. Not only was the shark itself supposed to be in more of the movie until technical difficulties made it impossible, but this added exposure would have resulted in gorier moments that harken back to Spielberg's Roger Corman days. None of these scrapped moments were more infamous than the death of Alex though, a young lad whose demise is mostly off-screen in the theatrical cut. Initially, his death was planned as a major set piece. A dummy of the actor was made, and the few behind-the-scenes images that remain show the shark with the boy's dead body in its mouth. Obviously, the graphic death of a child probably didn't fly with the ratings board, and it was ultimately cut to preserve the mystery of the monster. Number 4. Knowles' original assimilation. The Thing doesn't hold back with showing audiences the gory fates of its characters, but there is still one or two major mysteries that have kept horror fans talking about this film for decades. First and foremost, of course, is whether or not Childs, MacReady, or both were assimilated in the final scene. Coming in at a close second, however, is just what the hell happened to Knowles. In the movie, the facility's cook just kind of wanders out the story. It's suggested he gets killed by the Thing off screen, but the lack of any on-screen closure haunted fans for years. As you can probably tell by his inclusion on this list though, it wasn't supposed to be that way. Director John Carpenter did plan a huge blowout for this character, with pre-production storyboards showing in detail how the character was supposed to meet his end. Like so many others, he would have been assimilated and transformed into a skeletal monster with tentacles bursting out of his body. Ultimately, the filmmakers ran out of money and instead left his fate up to the audience's imagination. Number 3. The Crew's Bloody Orgy, Event Horizon. The tale of Event Horizon's original cut is legendary. While still a gory affair, the Paul W.S. Anderson sci-fi slasher was initially much more intense, so much so that most of the set pieces had to be cut down or omitted entirely to secure an R rating from the MPAA. Consequently, the theatrical cut only gives you quick flashes of what happened to the titular ship's original crew after they opened a portal to hell. It's still totally messed up, but the audience has to fill in most of the more graphic details that are only suggested and hinted at. A more extensive look at this bloody orgy as it became known did exist though, featuring the kind of explicit violence and sex that would make even die-hard horror aficionados blush. Sadly, in a move that reflects just how little the studio cared about the picture before it turned into a surprise cult hit, the original footage from this scene and others was either lost or badly damaged, ruining every fan's dream of an unrated director's cut. Number 2. Jeff and Sandra get spiked. Friday the 13th Part 2. While a lot of classic slashers seem pretty tame by today's post-Hostel standards, back in the day franchises like Friday the 13th were pushing gore as far as it could go in mainstream horror movies. In their constant battles with the MPAA though, so much footage just had to be deleted. Because this was before the era of home video and because horror movie preservation in general isn't that great, some of these uncut and alternate death scenes went unseen by fans for decades. Long thought to be lost, the cut death scenes from Friday the 13th Part 2 were finally found and restored in 2020 in time for a re-release. The uncut sequences don't change much from the originals, but the added gore is extremely welcome and makes the film a far harsher affair. Take the opening kill for instance, that sees original protagonist Alice stabbed in the head with an ice pick. In the uncut version, Jason actually turns her face to the camera with the ice pick coming out through her nose, making for a far more disturbing image. My favourite of the bunch though has to be the extended Jeff and Sandra scene. In the final cut, this is a pretty swift stabbing, but the new take is extremely bloody, lingering on the two being impaled together. Number 1. The cult biblical end, Red State. Kevin Smith's original ending for cult horror movie Red State would have either saved or damned it depending on who you ask. Generally, the flake is about a doomsday cult preparing for the rapture, who have kidnapped a bunch of young adults that they've deemed sinful. The feds, led by a weirdly cast John Goodman, eventually turn up for a standoff against the church members, resulting in all of the religious fanatics being shot. The original ending though, which was primarily scrapped due to budget limitations, would have actually shown the church members as being at least partially right. In this finale, the real rapture would have actually begun, resulting in real warrior angels descending from the sky. The church members would have violently exploded, while Ben Affleck's character from Dogma would have stabbed John Goodman's Fed with a big angel sword. It sounds absolutely wild and it might not have fit with the rest of the movie, but don't tell me that you don't want to see a filmed version of this scene.